That's quite unusual for a Prime Minister to effectively not only condemn George Galloway himself as a conspiracy theorist and friend of dictators, as the Prime Minister just said then, but also to condemn the electorate for the decision they took. I thought that was very striking, Kathy.
In recent weeks and months, we have seen a shocking increase in extremist disruption and criminality. What started as protests on our streets has descended into intimidation, threats, and planned acts of violence. Jewish children fearful to wear their school uniform lest it reveal their identity. Muslim women abused in the street for the actions of a terrorist group they have no connection with. Now our democracy itself is a target. Council meetings and local events have been stormed. MPs do not feel safe in their homes. Long-standing parliamentary conventions have been upended because of safety concerns. And it is beyond alarming that last night the Rochdale by-election returned a candidate who dismisses the horror of what happened on October the 7th, who glorifies Hezbollah and is endorsed by Nick Griffin, the racist former leader of the BNP. I need to speak to you all this evening because this situation has gone on long enough and demands a response not just from government, but from all of us. We are a country where we love our neighbours and we are building Britain together. But I fear that our great achievement in building the world's most successful multi-ethnic, multi-faith democracy is being deliberately undermined. There are forces here at home trying to tear us apart. Since October the 7th, there have been those trying to take advantage of the very human angst that we all feel about the terrible suffering that war brings to the innocent, to women and children, to advance a divisive, hateful ideological agenda. On too many occasions recently, our streets have been hijacked by small groups who are hostile to our values and have no respect for our democratic traditions. And I respect that the police have a tough job in policing the protests we have seen and that they are operationally independent. But we must draw a line. Yes, you can march and protest with passion. You can demand the protection of civilian life. But no, you cannot call for violent jihad. There is no context in which it can be acceptable to beam anti-Semitic tropes onto Big Ben in the middle of a vote on Israel-Gaza. And there can be no cause that you can use to justify the support of a prescribed terrorist group like Hamas. And yes, you can freely criticize the actions of this government, or indeed any government. That is a fundamental democratic right. But no, you cannot use that as an excuse to call for the eradication of a state or any kind of hatred or anti-Semitism. This week, I've met with senior police officers and made clear it is the public's expectation that they will not merely manage these protests, but police them. And I say this to the police: we will back you when you take action. But if we are asking more of the police, we in government must also back up that call with action. To that end, this month the government will implement a new, robust framework for how it deals with this issue, to ensure that we are dealing with the root causes of this problem, and that no extremist organisations or individuals are being lent legitimacy by their actions and interactions with central government. You cannot be part of our civic life if your agenda is to tear it down. We will redouble our support for the Prevent programme to stop young minds being poisoned by extremism. We will demand that universities stop extremist activity on campus. We will also act to prevent people entering this country whose aim is to undermine its values. The Home Secretary has instructed that if those here on visas choose to spew hate or protest or seek to intimidate people, we will remove their right to be here. And our Britain must not be a country in which we descend into polarised camps, with some communities living parallel lives. It is not enough to live side by side. We must live together united by shared values and a shared commitment to this country.
It was interesting, Patrick. He was sort of you're saying he needed to speak to you, the nation. He was trying to conjure up the kind of statements to the nation, national TV, that kind of thing that Boris Johnson did during the pandemic. But it was a very political thing, wasn't it?
It was a very political thing, and the Prime Minister was quite clearly trying to walk a delicate rhetorical tightrope between those messages of solidarity and reassurance and tolerance, but also making clear that he was going to launch a crackdown on radicalisation. You know, in amongst all of that conciliatory language was a definite sign of intent by the government to crack down on or impose a higher bar for policing on the protests we see on the streets of London and other major cities. There was also a pledge to increase funding for Prevent, the de-radicalisation programme, and a challenge to universities to act on radicalisation on their campuses as well. And if you add to that, of course, his outright condemnation of the decision voters in Rochdale took, he said it was horrifying that Rochdale had voted for George Galloway. That's quite unusual for a Prime Minister to effectively not only condemn George Galloway himself as a conspiracy theorist and friend of dictators, as the Prime Minister just said then, but also to condemn the electorate for the decision they took. I thought that was very striking, Kathy.
Do you think he's saying all of this in part because he's under so much pressure from the right of his party, Suella Braverman, Lee Anderson, Liz Truss, amongst others, and that he feels the need to signal sort of fresh legislation, tougher action to keep them at bay?
That will be part of it. Although, of course, the other way one could read all of that, you know, as well as the attack on protesters, that mirrors what James Cleverly, the Home Secretary, was saying this week. There was definitely a challenge to radicals on the right of British politics too. He singled out Nick Griffin by name. But the test of whether the Prime Minister means what he says, not just about radical Islamists or those who sympathise with Hamas and other terrorist organisations. He also mentioned the far right there. The question that begs, as you put to Hillary Armstrong just a moment ago, is you've got a predecessor there, Mr. Sunak, who spent several happy minutes on a stage as Steve Bannon called Tommy Robinson hero. That is the question that people on the moderate wing of Rishi Sunak's party will now be asking of the Prime Minister.
And perhaps why Rishi Sunak did not take questions, because those would have been among the first questions from journalists, wouldn't they?
Indeed, indeed. Well, there were lots of contradictions in that speech, of course, not least. Another one you may say is, if you're all for free speech, Prime Minister, why are you're making protests much harder? And why were you, the Prime Minister, a week ago, was sending out ministers to not quite defend Lee Anderson, who's since been suspended, of course, but not to condemn him? These are lots of questions the Prime Minister very tellingly chose not to take this evening.
Well, and however, maybe some of his intent was political. It doesn't potentially put pressure on Labour, doesn't it? Because he's putting them in a weak spot, and they're going to find it hard to respond, aren't they? Tell me what you think about that.
Well, look, the Labour Party is in an even trickier position in many ways than the Conservative Party, because what Rochdale shows us is that these fault lines the Prime Minister was talking about, this polarisation the Prime Minister was talking about, runs directly through the Labour Party, its parliamentary party, and its electorate. Rochdale proves that. Both the turnout, 40%, quite high for a by-election, and the decision voters eventually made for George Galloway. And the reason the High Command of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer's team, was so worried about George Galloway was the word polarisation, because they worried that it would drive the sort of wedge the Prime Minister is talking about there between white communities and Muslim communities, and in particular the Muslim community and the Jewish community, and give those who are trying to sow discord, in their view, a foothold in Parliament and an example to other people who might want to challenge the Labour Party and effectively punch this demographic bruise that's been exposed by the conflict in Gaza. So it's very, very tricky for them. And also, there are lots of different incentives pulling on Labour MPs, the demands for a ceasefire, the demands of their constituents. It'll be very, very difficult for the Labour Party to come out of this one in one piece too.